is that okay? Well, glad to be here with you, and not much going on where I work, so it's just, I've been looking forward to this all week. Bob Kendrick was here, right? One of my rules is never speak after Bob Kendrick, so clearly somebody is in big trouble, and they know who they are on my staff. Senator Congressman Cleaver and I are doing a coin for the Negro Baseball Museum. And we did one a couple of years ago for the World War I Memorial and the World War I Commission. And the way those federal coins, the way those coins work is you get the majority of members, both House and Senate, you agree to do this. I think it takes it may take 60% of both sides. We will get this done. But on the World War I coin, then Emmanuel and I went up for the striking of the coin in Philadelphia, which is the only time I've ever gotten to do that. And then people buy the coins, and once all the cost of the coin has been paid, then the recipient organization gets the money after that, and so forth. For the World War I memorial here, it's been $1.5 million. So one of the more successful coins, and still people are buying World War I, oddly, in many ways, much more impactful on what happens in the world today than World War II. But I think the Negro Baseball Museum will also be a great coin that people want to have, and we will get that done, and nobody will be happier than Bob Kendrick or use it more successfully than Bob Kendrick. I know some of you have talked about Carol Stark this week. She's a great friend of mine, not always fully bought into what I was for, but always fairly bought in to talking about it, and a great newspaper person. And I've been missing her, as I know you have. I think what I'm going to do, let's talk about whatever you want to talk about. If you want to give me some ideas, I'll try to weave that into what I'm talking about, and then we can add anything to that you want. I've started with Ukraine, which I thought you probably want to talk about, and trade. Anybody else know of a topic for sure you want to?
Rural broadband.
Rural broadband, very good. What else?
Floods.
What?
Floods.
Floods? Okay. What else?
Polarization.
What?
Polarization.
Polarization of the society, you mean?
Yes,
Yes,
of
okay.
the electorate.
Uh-huh. Okay.
What else?
What?
Opioids.
Opioids?
Medical marijuana.
Okay.
At the federal level.
Needed at the federal level is what you're thinking, right? Let's go there. Let's see how far I can get with that, and then we'll see what time we've got left. Well, first of all, the events of this week on the whistleblower. I'm on the Intel committee. We just about to finish up the Russia investigation, which in the case of the Senate Intel Committee really didn't produce any surprising results. The Russians were messing with our elections, just like they've been messing with elections in Eastern Europe and the rest of Europe for about 20 years, and for not very much money, really very successfully created chaos at a level that they probably wouldn't have expected. You know, Mrs. Clinton would have been elected, she would have been weakened by the election, but maybe not nearly as much chaos as the chaos that resulted. In terms of, if you're them and you're trying to get a return on investment, it may be the greatest return on investment in all time. The effort you made and the problems you created for the country that you are most concerned about in the world and see as the biggest adversary of what you believe in the world. And we were able to go through that almost as good as we handle other things in a nonpartisan way. It's been one of the best committees in the Senate, back to polarization, maybe largely because it's almost all behind closed doors, and you don't have quite the same maybe reason to make outlandish statements or draw attention to yourself. You want to just really get answers. And for whatever reason, I guess because Intel was involved, it was quickly decided, we're gonna turn this over to your committee to see what you can find out, and we'll see. I spent, yesterday I had to do something with the President of Columbia. Senator Cardin, a Democrat from Maryland, and I have just finished our second review of our relationship with Columbia. We did one 2 years ago as they were moving from Planned Columbia to Peace Columbia. So I had to go over and present this second paper with Senator Cardin yesterday in the middle of the day. I rushed out between, in the short break as it turned out, and did that. But before that, we had the acting head of Director of National Intelligence, who had another job for about 3 months before Dan Coach retired. And then the president chose not to put the deputy in, but to put the next highest ranking person in, which was literally the new guy on the block. You know, Admiral, former Navy SEAL, a good guy, but a good guy without really much intel or intelligence community background. So he's there. We spend quite a bit of time with him, and then the Inspector General for the intelligence community comes in, and that would have been the person that would have handled the whistleblower complaint. I think there aren't that many facts to put together here. It's a fairly narrow question, and we'll divide quickly, we'll polarize pretty quickly on that fairly narrow question. But I'm hopeful that we could put everything together pretty quickly. I think we need to talk to the Justice Department next. There's a lot of concern about, well, was that the right place for the acting DNI to go for legal advice? In addition to the DNI attorney, and I don't know where else you go for legal advice, but that was a lot of the discussion. There's, well, you made a big mistake by going to the administration to ask for administration about legal advice. The fact is, he's in the administration, and we'll see. But I think we should talk to the justice folks, and will. I'm trying really hard on this, as I did as long as I could on the Russian election, to not have a lot of opinions about it until we really have time to put all the facts together. Like I said, I think that will happen pretty quick. I don't know that the facts really matter here. It seems to me that the House is, they said this week, crossed the Rubicon, and I think they probably have. I think they are ready to go ahead and move forward on the impeachment effort that many of them wanted to do since the election, and more than that, have wanted to do since Democrats got control of the House. I actually think the Speaker's instincts on this have been right, that this is not good politics for them, that particularly at this date, probably a better way to settle this, which is the election. But I think the numbers just have finally sort of overwhelmed her ability to say no to her members forever. You can say no to members for a while, but if you're a leader in the House and Senate, eventually you have to reflect what the members want to do. This is the first week that Democrats in the House, that a majority of them were officially in favor of at least an impeachment inquiry. My guess is that probably leads to the House on a partisan basis moving forward with impeachment, and if they do, then of course it comes to the Senate. That might affect what happens in our committee a little bit. If we're not done with the investigating part before the House acts, if they act, we probably have to quickly consider, okay, we're gonna now become the jurors or the judges of this. Maybe it's time we stop being the investigators, but we'll see. If we have time to put all the information together, we will. I talk about newspapers a lot with my staff in the Trump world, and one reason I do is every week or so there's something that seems kind of overwhelmingly dominant. This may be the exception to that rule, but normally if I say, just go get the newspaper from 10 days ago, and I guarantee you, you won't believe that was 10 days ago. You'll think, oh no, that had to be like 4 months ago. That couldn't have been. The president does fill up the space. There is no doubt about that. We can come back to that if you want to. I'm not gonna have a lot of opinions about what this exact, set of circumstances leads to in terms of conclusions, though I have publicly said that I have some concern with this presidency, particularly that his ability to talk to foreign leaders generally has not been what you'd want it to be. If you'll recall, there was very early on, there was a leak of what he had said to the Australian Prime Minister. As I recall, it was maybe too pointed by any diplomatic standards, but we don't have better friends than the Australians. But that was leaked. Don't recall that ever happening before. Then the Mexican president, that was leaked. This is a real problem. And we'll determine whether the whistleblower should have blown the whistle or not, or somebody that told the whistleblower should have blown the whistle. But if the concern is they have tried to hold presidential conversations more tightly than would have been in the case of the past, the reason for that might be they need to hold it more tightly than they have in the past, because people seem to be unusually willing to talk about what the president and a foreign leader had talked about, and we don't benefit from that. If, for instance, in terms of the president asking foreign leaders to do things that are good for our country, they do that all the time. I'm sure the president had a number of conversations with the Prime Minister of Japan in the process of getting to signing the Japanese trade deal that week that were, hey, this would really be good for us, we think it'd be good for you, but let's get this done. That happens constantly, and you know, the president's sort of a stream of conscious guy. We'll see. We'll look at that and see what happens there. Trade generally, oddly, this is my own theory on this, I think in all likelihood the impeachment vote that the House will probably take actually helps USMCA. Now why would that be? Back to the school teacher here. Why would that be? You got 40 new Democrats, 30 of them roughly in seats that Democrats haven't held for at least a generation. If they have to take this vote, they're the people most likely to go to the speaker and say, you know, we really need this trade vote in our district. We need to have it. We just took a vote that is going to be hard to explain. Give us a vote that will be easy to explain. I've been concerned while the majority is clearly there, House and Senate, to pass Mexico, Canada, us trade, USMCA trade. Why would the speaker do that? And the only reason I've ever come up with, the majority of Democrats will not vote for it, but a majority of the House will. Why would the speaker do that? The reason the speaker would do that is because she's always is gonna have had these 30 or 40 people come to her and say, we really need this vote. And we know that you're gonna put something on the floor that a majority of Democrats in the House won't vote for, but we really need this vote, and without us, you don't have a majority. I think this is just another reason, this whole discussion, another reason. I'm not saying that's worth the other discussion. I want to see USMCA pass, but I think actually there'd be more pressure on the speaker to do that than there would have been before. The Japan deal, good. Third biggest economy in the world. I would have preferred to stay in TPP, particularly if you're going to fight China. I would prefer to stay in TPP, so just go drive a stake in their own backyard before you start that fight. Don't have a needless fight with our two biggest trading partners now, Mexico 1 and Canada 2. Don't get in any fight with the EU, and then there are plenty of reasons to fight China on trade, but trade fights, like lots of fights, are easier to get into than they are to get out of. And we'll see what happens there, but getting back into the Trans-Pacific, you know, we have an agreement with Australia, now we have an agreement with Japan. Good for us. We need to continue to make more of those bilaterals if that's how we're gonna pursue trade.
Senator, before you move on, real early in your remarks, you made a comment about the committee.
The Intel Committee?
Yep, that basically the Russian interference did influence the election, and that she would have won? Was that the finding?
No. What I was saying about Mrs. Clinton was, if she would have won, she would have been weakened by all the things that happened. I think the Russians are just for whatever's bad for us.
So they were just creating chaos.
In my view, unless they knew more about politics than every politician I know, none of whom assumed that the president was gonna win. If the Russians are that much better at our politics than we are, I'd be shocked. So I think their effort, but it probably wouldn't have had the spiraling impact that it had after, well, that was why this unlikely thing happened. That's why Trump got elected. Unlikely, by the way, probably not a smart choice of words there. Unanticipated result happened. They are for what is bad for us. Anything bad for us, the Russians would see as good for them. More and more the Chinese fall in that same category. And the Chinese much more concerning, because they actually have power to back up now their role in the world. The Russians punching way above their weight. The Russian economy is not as big as the California economy by a long way, for instance. The Chinese economy is. Yes?
I know you said earlier that you weren't going to have a lot of opinions about things until all the more
Right.
facts are in. But just in light of everything that's been going on since the last election, controversy and divisiveness and things like this, has President Trump been good for the Republican Party?
I think it's been good for the economy and good for the country and probably good for the Republican Party. We'll see. We'll see. The economy is stronger than it's been in a long time. It would be stronger if we could get these trade issues behind us, in my view. The regulatory environment is much better for the country than where we were headed. Things like waters of the U.S. and clean power rules that in our state would have been particularly negatively impactful. The fact that we still have some regulation, but they're more reasonable. If you've looked at the new overtime rule versus the old overtime rule, probably was time to increase the overtime standards to where people had to get overtime if they made less than a certain amount. But the new rules, it's about 26,000, I think, as opposed to 15 or so. And the Obama rule would have been 48,000. Everybody that made less than $48,000 couldn't have been a manager. A lot of people want to be a manager. So I think generally, all these choices are binary, just like the choice will be last time. You get to choose one person of two people. You don't get to choose one person or decide not to choose that one person. You get to choose one person of two people, and I think that's been good for the country. The binary choice, or the polarization. Now it may have started before the Clinton administration, but basically since some point in the Clinton administration till now, there had been a substantial group of Americans who didn't believe whoever was president had been rightly chosen or deserved to be there. I think that's been very polarized. So we're almost a generation into this. We're 25 years from the Clinton impeachment moment. Some things started before that, a minority vote, 3 candidates, the Electoral College didn't, all of that didn't produce the result that a lot of people thought it should have produced. There was a little of that then, but then with George W., first time in a long time that the candidate that got the most votes didn't get the presidency. And the way he doesn't believe it's all, is unfairly there. And then with Obama, people think somehow the president wasn't qualified to be president because of his birth certificate. I never understood that. My view always was, the president's mother was a U.S. citizen no matter where she was. So he was a U.S. citizen. And then now you've got this. So we've got a long time where you had a lot of Americans who just refused to accept the results of the election. And I think it's been polarizing. I think we've got too much polarized thought in the country, in the media itself. You know, it's real easy to watch the media that you tend to agree with, and every day you get just a little further back in the corner that you're inclined to be in. And I think I don't know what you do about it, but I think it's a very, the development, the way the media's developed, the constancy of the media, everything is breaking news. I think CNN just has a constant breaking news thing on the bottom of their screen. I don't watch it a lot, but every time I watch it, it says breaking news. Even if I'm going through the channels, that can't be helpful. I think that's a lot of it. And then some sense of the lack of fairness in the society, which I think we ought to work on.
Well, to clarify I was only going to ask that question. To clarify it a bit, you're talking to a room full of journalists, and we're working in this polarized situation. We're doing the best job we can to tell people what the news is, and it's just being called fake news, whether that's true or not. You know, tell us how we can do our jobs better in that kind of environment.
Well, I think most of you in the papers you run and the business you have are not in the fake news discussion. And if you are in the fake news discussion, anybody that reads most of your papers knows that you're not there, that you actually did report the community events last week properly, and you got the scores right, and all the photos from the games were right. And you know, many of you, particularly if you run the weekly papers, are sort of in the last sweet spot, and it's still not easy. I don't think any of it's easy now, but you're in the last sweet spot of journalism, where if you do what is working for you and do it really well, people still want to get their hands on that newspaper. If you don't think there's some fake news somewhere. If you don't think that, just sit down for a while and watch. Just go from station to station, and Fox News and MSNBC, or just like you're two very different stories going on. And most people, rather than try to watch them both and create the balance, as I said before, they tend to go to the one they agree with and have it on all the time, which is different than the kind of news business that most people in this room went to school to learn or grew up with, which no, we're fair, we're not gonna, it's sort of like many of the hometown newspaper, we're not gonna put anybody's city council sign, vote for in our yard, because we wanna be sure when we're reporting on the city council. Some of your parents had this discussion with you multi-generation news folks, where, no, we're not gonna do that, we're not gonna get in that, we're gonna stay out of that. There's more inclination maybe to be involved in a political level occasionally out of your community basis, but usually in the community very thoughtful not to be part of the polarization, even if it was totally appropriate polarization, like the generations of people in the military like George Marshall, who never voted. One of my favorite Truman stories on Israel, he's about to recognize Israel, and his Secretary of State, George Marshall, who is probably still the most revered man in the country 3 years after World War II, George Marshall says to Harry Truman about recognizing Israel, he says, if you do this, and if I were to vote in the next election, in this case, if I were to vote was a big deal because he never voted. If you do this, and if I were to vote in the next election, I would not vote for you. Which, if you put yourself in that room with Harry Truman and his Secretary of State, George Marshall, that's a pretty chilling kind of moment. But Harry Truman was not easily chilled, so he did it. And I don't know that George Marshall voted in the next election, so maybe it didn't matter. But that's sort of that removal that many people in family newspapers, for instance, had for a long time about the things they reported on, where they were the only source of that information, and we've lost some of that. Yes, sir.
Just real quick before we get out of here, I wanted to ask you, specifically in regards to Representative Sam Graves' bill, talking about the Missouri River flooding and how it kind of reins in the core and changes their focus.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
that? Where do you stand?
We'll get your flood question. I'm very involved in this. I think Sam is right. There's a moment here where I think if there's a moment here where we need to look at the southern basin of the river and maybe just the southern basin and see what we can do about the 2004 river management plan. 15 years, 13 of which we have had more flooding than we would have had in past years with the same amount of rainfall. And not getting a fight with the northern basin about how much water they hold back, or there's a fight you could have there, but I think if we would get to where we tried to manage the river better, if we put navigation return navigation as one of the premier purposes of the river, for a long time, the three priorities of the river were flood control, navigation, and drinking water. And they're still theoretically supposed to be the top priorities, but the money has never followed that. We've got, the Interior Department is willing to work with us on going back to the wildlife issues and having to have a new regulation that I believe they're about to put out, where you'd have to evaluate the impact of people and property as part of your wildlife decisions, and they haven't done that since 2004 on Missouri. Then R.D. James, the civilian head of the Corps from Missouri, on the Mississippi River Commission for 30 years, civil engineer, understands the river as well as anybody, is in charge of the Corps in the river. He and I probably talk every week right now. I've talked to all the commanders, from the Northwest Commander to the our goal is to try to see what we can do with the southern basin to restore navigation. A 10-foot channel carries a lot more water than a 7-foot channel. If you'd revert the river back to where you had the river management tools like the revettes and the dikes and the things that were there in the 80s and were still pretty good in the 90s, when you either tore them out or didn't take care of them in the decade after 2004, they've gone away, and trying to manage the river again to where it becomes an economic asset as well as another kind of asset. I feel pretty positive that if there is a moment, this is that moment. I've gotten all 8 of us, the senators in the southern basin, which would be Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. I've gotten all of us together. We all are in agreement, at least on the launching point. We're prepared just to talk about the southern basin and not get deeply into the issues of all the states north of us, and see what we can do to try to break this pattern. Rural broadband. Rural broadband is important to communities today and families today as the telephone was 75 years ago. We have to insist that we have it available to people, everything from precision farming to whether the kid who lives 5 miles from school has the same advantage doing their homework as the kid that lives 2 blocks from school. The kind of economy you can be part of if you have rural broadband. I think rural broadband, more than any other single thing, may determine whether a lot of our communities from say 300 to 3,000 grow and thrive or become places where people live because, one, they've always lived there, or they moved there because the rent's cheap because people aren't living there. And there are a lot of people that want to live in towns like that, where the church still matters, where high school sports is still a big deal, where if everybody in town doesn't know where you are, they generally know what house you live in if you're a kid. I grew up, Stratford, Missouri, when I was little, had 300 people, has 3,000 now, but still not very big, had 300. Every single adult, I was never offended by Mrs. Clinton's book, It Takes a Village. There wasn't an adult in that town who didn't feel like they could tell me, they could correct me if they thought I was doing something wrong. And if there was one, they could somehow always call my mother before I got home. And there are a lot of people who, that really would be appealing to get back to that kind of community where the school is a focus, the church is a focus. And if the critical thing you may need for that to happen is to be really connected to the greater economy. And nothing will do that more effectively than high-speed broadband. It's not the only answer, but it's a big part of the answer to whether those communities thrive or not. And, we got behind in ways that I don't quite understand, the other states, or many of the other states. Now, we're fighting hard on that, and we're getting a substantial amount of the money available at the federal level to do this. The legislature is engaged. We've gone from about 54% of rural Missourians didn't have access to high-speed broadband 5 years ago, to now the number's more like 31%, but that's still high as it relates to the rest of the country. And I'm on the Commerce Committee. FCC reports to us. Like I said, we're getting more. The last time we had the committee in, I said, okay, you've allocated this money in Missouri and other places to companies that you thought could do the job. I'm going to insist if they can't do the job, the money still stay with us. And I want to know what every one of you think about that, and they all decided to agree with that. But 6 months earlier, their position had been, if the company can't spend the money, it goes back into the bigger pot, and we'll divide it up again one more time among the whole country. And, my view was, your fault if you picked the company that couldn't do what the company was supposed to do, FCC. And if they can't do it, I want a commitment from you that all the money that's been allocated to try to catch us up stays here.
Before you move on, when you're traveling around the state, because I know you do that a lot, like you're gonna be in Clark County, sometime next week, like, how are you personally seeing the difference in these rural communities without access to high-speed internet?
Without access?
Yeah, like what are some of the things you see when you're on the road?
Well, I think what you see is people wind up living there who, one, are generally retired and have always lived there, or two, people who, even maybe young, but people who are maybe not retired, but find the availability of housing better there than other places. I think rural broadband will help create a vibrance in the community that otherwise may not be there.
So are you seeing like a lack of rural broadband in some of these smaller communities, kind of like extending the economic gap, as far as like?
Yes. No doubt that a lack of rural broadband extends the economic gap. We're gonna have, like I think I mentioned, we're gonna have precision farming. There are a lot of jobs that people no longer go to the office to do, or a lot of payroll companies and things like that, where it's all transmitted back and forth. There are real opportunities, and there's no reason you can't do that in a small Missouri community as opposed to do that 5 blocks away from where the company you're working for is, if you're connected properly. And we just need to insist that happen. Yes. I'm going to come to opioids in a minute.
The money for the rural broadband projects was divided, as you were talking about. But there hasn't really been a whole lot going on yet. What's next?
Well, there's a lot going on. I mean, the rural electric co-ops have, not all of them, but they have become really active in this space. And there's a lot of build out going on. And what's next is in areas that they're still not served or even underserved. We need better maps. That's part of the build out problem. And we're insisting at the federal level on better maps, where one person in a census tract that some big company says they provide broadband to isn't enough to take that whole census tract off the map. So better maps, better commitment, more examples of success always help. I think our co-ops generally have been the biggest entry into this field in the last 10 years, and they seem to be particularly well suited to do it. but they don't all do it because some places there's somebody else who's gotten there earlier, or they just think they're not big enough yet, or whatever.
In our area, the contract went to, an ISP out of, Illinois there, St. Louis. And, so the rural, the electric co-op in Perry County has done a little bit of it, but they're not pretty much at all involved. That's why I was curious as to what was gonna happen, you know.
Well, I'm not critical of the co-ops that haven't done it, but I'm certainly admiring what some of the co-ops have done. I was at United the other day, United Co-op, which was, near Plattsburgh, Cameron, that area. But they've also begun to reach down a little with the Clay Como Co-op people who didn't think they needed it in most of their area. They're serving the unserved areas with that. I think we will fill these gaps. I think the last distribution of FCC money, we got 17% of all the money. We clearly don't have 17% of all the population. And the Commerce Committee is generally John Thune from South Dakota and Roger Lippert from Mississippi rather, and Deb Fisher from Nebraska, and Jerry Moran and I. It's generally people who are very sensitive to states with significant rural populations. So this is very much a top of mind issue. On opioids, we're getting there. It's more of a small town and rural problem, frankly, than it is an urban problem. The opioid problem generally has been, in our state, our biggest advantage in the opioid fight is we're one of 8 pilot states in a program that Senator Stabenow from Michigan and I envisioned and got into law in 2015, Excellence in Mental Health, where most Missourians have access through the community behavioral health centers or the federally qualified health centers that have added behavioral health to behavioral health just like it was any other health. And in other states where you're fighting the opioid issue, you can get somebody off the opioid thing for a while, but if you're not dealing with that mental health part of it appropriately, you don't solve the problem totally. And most states under Medicaid have a 14-day maximum or a 21-day maximum. In Missouri, we have no maximum. Just like as long as your kidney was failing, they're still gonna deal with your kidney as long as you've got a behavioral health issue. If you can find the location, and you can deal with that behavioral health part of opioids and other addictions. If you don't have a mental health problem before you get addicted, you have one after you get addicted. And on that front, on the mental health front, something I spend a lot of time on. The National Institute of Health, NIH, says that 1 in 5, at least 1 in 5 adult Americans has a diagnosable and almost always treatable behavioral health problem. 1 in 9 has a behavioral health problem that impacts how they live every single day. And our state's actually pretty good at this, but our country is not good at it, and our state's not as good as we ought to be